everyone. Welcome back to the Imperfect Podcast. I'm your host, Kirsten Pfeiffer, and I am here today with Sarah Godoy. Sarah is a doctoral student, graduate research assistant, and Royster Fellow at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill School of Social Work. In 2017, Sarah was named number 20 of the top 100 human trafficking and slavery influence leaders, which I didn't even know that until you sent me this bio. I'm like, okay. So her area of research focuses on youth and young adults impacted by commercial sexual exploitation in the juvenile justice and child welfare systems and their intersection with healthcare and social services as well as technology. Sarah has been a research associate in UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine since 2017. And if anyone listened to episode 4 with Rebecca Sadwick, that's actually how I met her because they worked together in that research at UCLA. Sarah has also worked as a lecturer at UCLA and has spent time researching in the red light district of Tijuana, Mexico, and practiced social work with women and children in brothels of Old Delhi, India's red light district. She's published peer-reviewed articles, research reports, and magazine articles, including 5 articles in Forbes magazine about commercial sexual exploitation. This is just her short bio. I could literally keep going on about this, but I think that's a great place to start. I am so impressed by you, Sarah, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. And so I was not planning on starting this conversation this way, but yesterday I got in a car accident, as Sarah knows, but anyone listening, I got into a car accident. Thankfully, I'm okay. But Sarah, I told her this, and she, texted me this morning and made sure that I was okay and was like, we can totally reschedule, and was like willing to shift her already super packed schedule for me. And it was such a good reminder of being in this space. And so anyone that is in the anti-trafficking space that's listening, or in the activism space, or even just in your daily lives, it's so important to prioritize self-care and also surround yourself with people that remind you of that. And I just had this moment of gratitude this morning of seeing that. And so thank you for being so awesome. But also anyone listening, before we dive into this heavy stuff, make sure that you're taking care of yourself. And so that's why a lot of the other episodes also are focusing on mental health and self-care. But I think it also,
I love that.
I think it also speaks to your character and also why you have had this amazing success in this industry, because you clearly take care of yourself, and that is what makes you sustainably able to do this work. But you really care about people. And so that's what we're actually going to be talking about a lot today, why we need to focus on people. I think this is a cause that a lot of well-intentioned people get into, but they forget that at the heart of this is people.
Right.
Yeah.
I love that introduction. I was not expecting those beautiful comments. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I think it's been on the fore of my mind recently of how during the pandemic, really we were in a dual pandemic. We had COVID-19, we had the rise against police brutality and police violence, and Black Lives Matter movement, and all of these things that were really traumatic. And I was often in spaces where we were constantly talking about how traumatic life was at the moment, but we weren't taking time to end meetings early. We weren't rescheduling things. And it really had to take a pause and advocate for myself and really press, I need to take a break because life is incredibly hard right now. Yeah. And even if we have 100 things that are in line for the day, sometimes you just have to put a pause and say, my mental health, my physical health, my health is more important than everything else, because if I cannot sustain myself, then literally I could not even make it to the end of the day. Yeah,
it's so important. And I think we get in these places where we're like, oh, I can just push through for myself. But when you think about the fact that, in the Bible, it says love others as you love yourself. And whether, you're Christian or not, that's just a saying that a lot of people say. But what's key about that is in order to love others, you have to love yourself. Right. So if you're not loving yourself well, the way that you're loving other people is not going to be as full. So
that's a great reminder. I also just want to add to that. I feel like part of what I truly believe is having a servant heart is so necessary. Yeah. And yes, love yourself, love the Lord that you serve, the God that you serve. but also loving others. Like that is really, I think, the heart and the crux of so many, of the Bible, but so many religions and spiritualities as well, is like really serving other folks in a way that is like in some way going to advance peace or justice or equity.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, in this work, I've found myself really in the beginning afraid to even speak publicly like this and have these conversations, because I was scared of saying the wrong thing, because it is such a sensitive topic. It is a fine line between, like, we don't want to hold back in any way out of fear, but I think the way to combat that what I've found is really focusing on people, because I think a lot of the times when we say the wrong things, it's because we're losing sensitivity and empathy for the people that have gone through this trauma.
Agreed.
And we're just so focused on, like, oh my gosh, 40.3 million victims, like, how do I help all of them? And again, it's like, that's a noble thing.
Right.
But we got to scale it back before we do more harm than good.
Right.
And so we're going to get into that. However, I want to just start by laying out, in case this is someone's first episode that they're listening to about trafficking, I have a lot of other episodes where we cover some of this, but just in case, to get everyone on the same page, can you lay out generally what human trafficking is?
Sure. So across the world, there are 3 different types of human trafficking that we talk about. We have labor trafficking, which is said to be the most prevalent anywhere and everywhere in the world, in the US and beyond. We have sex trafficking, which I'll give our federal definition for both adult and child sex trafficking. And we have organ trafficking. And that occurs also throughout the world. But interestingly, federal legislation in the United States only covers both labor and sex trafficking. And so unfortunately, oftentimes organ trafficking is not part of the conversation, although it is very real and it does impact countless folks.
Does that happen in the U.S. too?
Illicit activities happen everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So we might not hear about it. We might not know about it. We might not quantify it in any type of way. But it doesn't mean that illicit activities aren't occurring, including likely organ trafficking.
Right. Because the reason why I ask that is I figured that, it's not like, no, that's never going to happen in the United States. But I did think of it as a broad situation, because I think of the fact that, the legislation that I've read and heard and like how US defines it is labor and sex. So it's interesting, and we'll kind of get into that later in the conversation about like how legislation impacts all that as well, and the misconceptions that we have about it. Yeah. But I'll let you continue.
We'll get there,
with the rest.
So labor trafficking, as I mentioned, is really, as some examples, domestic servitude, folks who are maybe working as migrant workers, they get taken advantage of. Oftentimes folks are coming from other locations, coming into the United States. They might have come from Africa and now they're working in the household as a domestic worker. They could have come from South America, Latin America, and now they are picking the fruit that we eat. And so those are some examples of labor trafficking. Essentially, both labor and sex trafficking have one underlying theme, and that's the exploitation. They're exploitative in nature. And so sex trafficking, I'm going to pivot, and that's the focus of our conversation today, is essentially the coercion, manipulation, or using fraud to induce a person age 18 or older into any type of commercial sexual activity. So that could be transactional sex, it could be fellatio, it could be erotic dancing, pornography, in exchange for anything of value. Notably, the anything of value, it could be money, it could be status, it could be basic needs like food or shelter or something like that. So monetary, non-monetary value, that could go directly to the person, or it can go to someone else like a trafficker. So as long as anything is exchanged, whether or not they actually receive it or benefit from it. For minors, we have the cornerstone of anti-trafficking legislation, which I'm talking about right now, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. There's one important caveat for minors, and this is only for sex trafficked minors. So sex trafficked minors do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. So any minor engaging in any type of sexual activity at all in exchange for anything of value is deemed commercially sexually exploited. They're deemed sex trafficked. And what's really important is because I've been in this field since 2014, and I've worked with social workers, I've worked with doctors, I've worked with public health professionals, really the gamut. And one thing that folks really didn't understand or know at the onset of these conversations, and still even today, is that a minor does not have to have a quote unquote trafficker. They don't have to be forced into doing it. They could literally have been thrown out of their home, been looking for food, got approached by someone that says, I'll trade you sex for dinner.
Wow.
And that in that moment, the moment that this exchange happens, they are now sex trafficked.
And I think so much of what we're going to get into is about the misconceptions that we have. And I think that's one of them. And that's why, and I know I have qualms about using even the term prostitute.
Right.
But there is no such thing as a child prostitute. So when you hear that, it's like they're victims of trafficking. But even the word victim, like there's so much of that.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you how you got involved in this work.
Sure,
and like what kind of sparked that passion.
So when I was getting my master's degree in social welfare at UCLA, in the program we had, for really like one of the first times, they had the opportunity for master's students to go abroad. And so a few of us applied, and I really wanted to go to India. We were selected. I was one of 3 selected to go to India. So we went, and when we were there, we partnered with the School of Social Work at the University of Delhi. And they essentially allowed us to see a lot of different nonprofit social enterprises. And they said, you get to pick your internship. We're doing like site visits. Pick the one that you think. And the very last one was with a nonprofit named Cat Cafe, still in existence. I still love them very much. And they were in the brothels. And they were serving the women who were predominantly sex trafficked, teaching them skills like sewing and cooking, and their children. So an educational program after they were in school, they could go there. Or if they weren't in school, they could go to this nonprofit. And they were teaching English, and they were tutoring in math. They had dance classes, a lot of fun activities. And I was there in India, in Delhi, and I loved it so much. And I just remember this incredible heaviness of being in the brothels, of knowing that any woman or any person who walked into the brothel, your life was at risk at any time point. And so we would walk in the brothels, and we would do site visits. And there was this time in particular where, so social code, if you were in the red light district at the time, you couldn't look men in the eyes, because that could indicate to them that they could buy sex from you, or they could basically do whatever they want to you.
Oh, wow.
And so you, as a woman, what I had to do, and the folks I was with, we had to look down on the ground or look up at the ceiling. And so I just remember thinking, before that visit, I felt so strong and powerful. Like I felt like I had so much agency and autonomy in my life. And within minutes, I felt like my sole protection was one of the 18-year-old boys, sons of the mom who was, again, predominant, like sex trafficked. Her son went to the nonprofit, and he was like what we called our protector, because we couldn't walk through the red light district alone as women. We had to have a man with us at all times. Even if it was a child or minor, it had to be a boy with us.
Wow.
Because that was our protector. And so we go outside after this particular site visit. It was really chaotic. It was a brothel known to have the youngest children and youngest people within the entire red light district, the busiest as well because of that. And we're standing there in the red light district, unable to look men in the eyes, unable to even really talk because of the fear. And I remember feeling internally angry. Like I had like this fire inside of me. And there was a lot of other instances. This is only one instance.
Right.
And we go back to the nonprofit, and then we finally, we go back to our Airbnb for the night. And I'm just like sitting there crying, like we're safe now. But these kids live in the brothel, and they're going back to the brothels. And this, we'd already known an 11-year-old when she was 10. She was part of the kids that we worked with. They tried to buy her, sex bearers tried to buy her for sex. I think she was approached 3 different times. And finally, her mom's boyfriend agreed, who was the quote unquote pimp of the brothel, agreed to sell her for $600 for her virginity. And so, we're in this, like, trying to do good work, trying to work with these kids. And it was just incredible to see the dynamic. And that's not specific to India. There's red light districts all over this world, legal or illegal. And there's places all over the world, including in the US. And that was incredibly powerful. And I just remember, like, everything in my heart and soul after that moment was like, I belong here. Like, this is what I need to be doing. I need to work against sex buying, against sex trafficking. And I didn't really know what that meant. And then I worked with young folks here in Los Angeles County, and they were all minors. They were in their teens, young women, and they were already survivors. And they were resilient and they were kind. And by the way, those kids in the brothels were so resilient, so fun, so funny, so great. Like, we had so much fun hanging out with them. Like, it was a different world from the brothels. So I'm here and I'm working with the kids in Los Angeles. And there was just this moment where I was just like, if I'm not spending every day of the rest of my life fighting for these young people, then I'm truly not fulfilling my purpose in this world. Like, this is my heart and this is my soul and this is my purpose. And like, I never looked back. After that, it was like, let me do anything and everything that I can do. Yeah.
Wow. I feel like we're like kindred spirits, because I'm like, that's literally, not literally, but similar to the experience I had. I had started hearing about human trafficking first through a church conference I was at. A21 had a campaign there, and I was so shook. I was like, what was that I just saw? I need to go to the lobby and buy a t-shirt, because like I just like needed to do something. But it's planted that seed. And then I'm an actress. I was at an event for SAG. I never go to SAG events, and it was all about using film to fight human trafficking. And there's a whole panel of different nonprofits, people from government there, actors that go undercover on these stings. And that I was like, this is what I'm here for. I always knew my acting career was more than just my acting. It was like something more that I wanted to attach it to. And that was like, okay, this is it. And then a few months later, I was on a mission trip in Guadalajara. We were at this girls' orphanage, and a few of the girls that I really bonded with that day, I found out at the end of the day from the director that they were all survivors of trafficking. And I just lost it, because I was like, they were so, like you said, resilient and pure and
sweet and kind,
and seemed like they had no burdens. And I'm here on this mission trip, like half my mind was in LA, stressed about other things, right? And it's like, I think we can really learn something from that. But also I felt that same, like, I need to protect these people, but not in a way that is like, we're going to get into savior complex, right? But like, I was like, with the only thing that makes me different than these individuals was that I was born into a family that didn't exploit me. And so like, how can I use what I've been given to be a voice? And like, I went back to my hotel that we were staying at. It was like a really nice hotel in the middle of
the air conditioning, like you have just anything you need at your disposal.
Right. But after you have one of those moments, like, you can't forget it. And I think it's so important to really think about those people, whether you've had that encounter or not, to think about the people, because I know you definitely know this, but like, in the thick of it, in the grind of it, in the research, it can be really like demystifying and desensitizing when you're looking at the data. That's where we can start to say things and do things that are maybe hurting people more than helping the cause. So I think like, just attaching it to that passion and that purpose is like what has really sustained me. And so I think that's a good place to transition to, of what is person-centered language. And
so I love everything that you said, and I definitely agree. And you said earlier the protecting but moving away from the saviorism. And so I like to reframe it as, my job isn't to go in and save anybody. My job is not to go in and protect these people from the things that ultimately it's a whole other world.
Right.
But my job is to meet them where they are and to serve them.
Wow. Yeah.
And like, what do they need in that time? You know, like if I'm going to go and do great work, then I need to partner with the people who are already doing it and the people with lived experience and find out, how can I fill a gap, and what does not already exist? What can I do?
Wow.
And how can I serve?
Yeah.
And so I just like to reframe it, you know, because I think when we talk about serving folks and we talk about person-centered language, I think at the heart and the soul is the person. And it's recognizing that there's an entire human being here, and their experiences of sex trafficking are just that. Their experiences. Their trauma is a result of your experiences, but you are not your trauma. You are not your experience of sex trafficking. And so we've moved away from, in publications, in talks, you know, in discourse, generally, at least my research teams, the research teams that every team I join, I really try to bring this of like, we need to start with the person and recognize them, and then ask them, how would you feel comfortable? How would you like me to refer to you? And I've asked folks and they're like, by my name.
Wow.
By me, not as a child prostitute, not as a juvenile prostitute, not as a sex worker, not as, and there's times when they're like, oh, like, you know, you can call me whatever. But it's like, no, let's get to like who you are, because no one should just be able to call you whatever, right? Like if someone were to meet you and they were to just so happen to know about the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to you. And then every time they talk to you, they're like, oh, this is whatever your trauma is. This is who you are. And now I've defined you as that. And I'm going to ensure that everyone else knows who you are. Wow. Like that is exactly what we need to work against. We need to work in a space where we're empowering folks with lived experience. They want to call themselves, as recognize that they've survived something, call themselves a survivor. Then yes, they're a survivor. If that's what they say, that's what they are. But when we come around, when we're around them and you have no lived experience, so it's the caveat. Folks with lived experience, like they can say what they would like, and that is their choice and their autonomy. But folks without lived experience, outsiders looking in, you know, honor people first by their personhood, and then whatever else they see as the appropriate way to talk about it. Right. And if they don't want that as part of their story and their identity, then honor that, you know? And so when I work with folks and I write, you know, it's a mouthful, but I try to say a youth who's impacted by commercial sexual exploitation, a youth who has a history of sex trafficking, a child who has experienced, right? And so you start with who they are as a person. And I can't reiterate that enough because, you know, I've said this over and over and over again. And then people will ask me a question and they'll be like, so when you talk to victims, I'm like, so when I talk to a person who has been victimized, right? Or when you're talking to survivors, I don't know if they see themselves as a survivor. When I talk to someone who's had this experience. And so I think, you know, really just the emphasis on personhood, the same way that we would probably not identify with our trauma and the way that we've slapped that label on them. And I've worked with young people that are like, oh yeah, I know I'm CSEC, the term commercial sexual exploitation of children. I'm like, you're not CSEC. You're a person who's had an experience of commercial sexual exploitation. You're not an acronym. Right. Like that's not who you are. And they're like, well, that's what I've heard. And well, the people who said it were misinformed because you are you.
Right. And I can't help but think that so much of this comes down to either our own uncomfortable feelings of wanting to ask those questions because it's like, oh, I don't want to step on your toes and like ask the wrong thing, but also laziness. Because, like, let's just call it what it is. And honestly, like, I find myself the same way. It's like, it is a mouthful to be like a person with lived in experience, a person that's experienced this. But it makes so much sense when you lay it out in comparison to other traumas. Like, just as a lighthearted example, like, relatively lighthearted. My parents are divorced. Like, I don't just introduce myself as a person with divorced parents all the time, right? But it's funny because, it's just like that's what it really is. And so I love that you highlight it that way because it's so obvious when you put it into other contexts.
Yeah.
But I have noticed, because I am working on a film about human trafficking and connecting with organizations, they're very protective, as they rightfully should be, because again, a lot of well-meaning individuals come in. I want to raise awareness for this, but again, they're looking at these people as not people. They're looking at them as just like a category of their trauma.
Or a cause.
Right? And so
like, this is the cause I'm passionate about. And well, these are the people that I'm passionate about.
Yes, we have to shift it from people to cause, or from cause to people. And I actually think that my conversation with you like earlier this year really helped me think a lot about this as I have been working with these individuals, because I don't think any of them would have corrected me if I referred to them as a survivor.
Right.
But what I have learned through working with these organizations that are very protective, and I'm so grateful that they've let us in after we've shown that we're there for the people and not the quote cause. But it's like, these are individuals that their trauma has been solely around the exploitation of their bodies and of their boundaries and all of that. And so then these people that want to make an impact, quote unquote, come in, and without realizing it, they're exploiting them for the trauma that they walked through. And it's again reinforming and like re-putting this thing in their head that their value only comes from the trauma that they experienced. And we have to break away from that.
Yeah. And to build on that, I think one of the things that's most interesting is I've worked with young people, and they're like, the worst trauma in my life wasn't being sex trafficked. The worst trauma in my life was being molested by my mom's boyfriend. The worst trauma was going into the foster care system. The worst trauma was not the exploitation. But I agree, we need to be mindful as adults working in this space how we don't re-exploit people. I have a laundry list of ways that we can work against that, like adequately paying people for their time, like using trauma-informed approaches, like using person-centered language, some of these things, but also recognizing that a lot of folks who've been exploited have an entire continuum of trauma. And that's, I started this off by like, meet them where they are. Like, where are they? And maybe they want to talk about a different trauma. Maybe you're not there to talk about their trauma. Maybe they're just there because they have a tour of a school and you're of a university and you work on that university. Or maybe it has absolutely nothing to do with anything and they're just there and they want, and so I think just being really mindful of like positionality of the power that we have, and what our role is, and sticking to it.
It's so true. And my roommate, she's a social worker, and she works at a group home for people that have experienced sex trafficking in Los Angeles. And so she said, honestly, a lot of the times they don't want to talk about the trauma. They're more concerned about the fact that their roommates didn't do the dishes. Like, they're people, right?
And so like they're often teenagers. Like, they're like concerned about like, oh, I want to get my hair done. I want to get my nails done. Like, they have things that their lives do not necessarily revolve around that experience. And we shouldn't make it seem like that.
And I think, we both have had more experience in this field than the average person. So, I mean, it's part of the reason why it does become dehumanized and we are looking at them as numbers and not people, I think is because of the messaging around it.
Oh my gosh, I have so much to say.
So please, go ahead, whatever you want to say about that.
I think, so in 2015, I was in my first research position, a researcher at UCLA at the Luskin Center for Innovation with Becca, a colleague who was on episode 4, I believe, so a plug. But we were on this research team, and once the report was finished, we were I was looking for an image with someone in the Luskin school, like trying to basically push it out. And they're like, okay, like we can afford to buy like an image. What kind of image do you want in the front? And I was like, well, I want something really like light, like something light. I want like a golden light. I want light. I want to move away from the typical messaging, which even now, if you Google image search sex trafficking, you're going to see gray, you're going to see black, you might see red, you'll see like bruises, you'll see chains, you'll see hands over mouths. You'll see these images that are so terrifying and evoke fear. And yes, sex trafficking and child sex trafficking is horrific and it's terrible and it is dark and it is scary and it's nightmare ensuing and it results in depression and PTSD and eating disorders and a lot of mental health diagnoses and comorbidity. But when we think about the imagery and we're talking about survivors or folks who have moved out of the trafficking experiences and now they've survived this, we need to shift it and stop reinforcing this dark, scary imagery that frankly I think scares a lot of people from wanting to learn more and get involved.
Yeah.
Because as dark and as evil as it is, I've worked with so many children who are beautifully lit up and have this like intense just beauty and light and air around them. And like that's what I see when I see these kids that I've worked with. Like I see that and beyond, you know, the darkness, I think we have to reshape the way that we think about it and reframe it so that folks feel like they can do something. So that they feel like, okay, I'm not about to walk into the most evil thing I've ever seen in this complete darkness, but like I can see and feel and be part of that light.
Yeah, it's so important. And that's why I mentioned A21 before, but they talk about doing it for the one. And, you know, part of that comes down to, again, getting back to thinking of people and thinking of the one person. Because if you think about this darkness and this heaviness and it, like you said, it is very dark. It is very heavy. There are millions of people that are, you know, experiencing that. But that's going to make no one move to action, and myself included.
Yeah, it's paralyzing.
I remember when I saw the A21 campaign years ago, the reason why I bought a t-shirt was because that's all I knew how to do at the time, right? But like I found even on my own journey, just taking the next step. So even if that looks like buying a t-shirt to support an organization, like there's so much that we can do, and there's so much with our giftings and areas of influence that we can do. So like one of those things we were talking about before was legislation.
Right.
I know that, you know, I know some lawyers as well that like they've gone pro bono and they've worked with helping some of these individuals that have experienced sex trafficking, getting their criminal records expunged, things like that. But getting to the legislation piece, I think legislation also sometimes impacts how we perceive trafficking. So can you, I know that could be its own podcast conversation, but would love just like your thoughts.
Very briefly, I absolutely think that discourse influences legislation. So the way that we think about and talk about something influences the policies that are emergent and vice versa. So for example, in the United States, our federal policy, our first piece of contemporary anti-trafficking legislation was passed in the year 2000. That piece of legislation has an important caveat for sex trafficked minors, but the same protections of not having to prove force, fraud, and coercion are not there for adults or for children who've been labor trafficked. We don't, I think, in the United States, federally at least, have a really, truly comprehensive piece of legislation and protection. And that trickles down. And also, you know, oftentimes folks aren't really aware of policy. And so they kind of have an idea of what something is, but they might perpetuate misconceptions because they don't really know what the policy says or because the policy isn't really comprehensive. And so I think in California, we have a very liberal definition of commercial sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. So important. This legislation in California says basically that even if you have the intent of selling someone for sex, of exploiting someone, of exploiting a minor, that is commercial sexual exploitation. Wow. So they don't have to, a youth never has to engage in the commercial sexual activity if it's intervened before that time point, and they can still get the services and opportunities that are available for people who have been trafficked. Oh, wow. Because the intention is there. And the person who was attempting to sell them can still be prosecuted. Wow. That's a really liberal definition, and that is not the same across the United States or across the world. And it doesn't mean that implementation is always going to look like that, right? And that local law enforcement or folks will respond in the same way. But I think policy, really needs to do a better job of being comprehensive and protecting all people who are being exploited, no matter the age, no matter the race, no matter their citizenship status. If you're in the United States and you are being exploited or someone's intending to exploit you, there should be protections for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, I was talking to someone recently about this. I never even really thought about this, but how we have all this protection for minors, and as soon as they age out of that, like they still could have had the same circumstances that brought them into that life, but there's all of a sudden you're not protected.
And so many folks that are trafficked, they might have been trafficked as a minor, but they're not recognized as being trafficked until they're like 20, 21, and they're already an adult. And so even if they were trafficked as a minor, they still don't have those protections. Yeah. But if you are trafficked as an adult, I work with a young person with she's around my age, so I don't know if we're going to deem that young enough, I guess.
You're young, yeah.
But I work with this young woman, and she basically said, I didn't know that I was sex trafficked for years, even out of the exploitation. Yeah. I thought I was a sex worker because she was already an adult, and people were treating her very differently. And we know, in the United States, we treat people in the sex industry terribly. We call them either a quote unquote prostitute or a quote unquote sex worker. And then all of a sudden, because they have that stigma on them, we no longer treat them as if they're people. Yeah. They're treated as if they're dirty, as if they have no value, as if their only value was the sex that they provided for some predominantly probably man who was purchasing sex.
Yeah. So with that, I'm actually really curious your thoughts on legalizing prostitution, if you think that would help or hurt things.
So before I got into anti-sex trafficking field in 2014, in my senior thesis in undergrad was on Nevada brothels and women, or the people who sell sex, and the only legal form of commercial sex in the United States. So I interviewed someone who worked for a brothel. Very, very kind person. She agreed to do the interview with me. And the crux and the takeaway is that legalizing commercial sex will always be for the sex buyer. It will always be to protect the sex buyer. Just because it's legal and now we have a place where sex buyers can come and safely buy sex or frequently buy it out in the open, doesn't mean that it's safe for the people who live in brothels. I learned very quickly that the protections that exist are for the sex buyers. So for example, in brothels, the women who sell sex, they get tested for STIs very frequently. So sexually transmitted infections, they get tested frequently. If they get an infection, from my knowledge, from my experience from this woman, if you get an infection, you are literally fired and that's it. Wow. But if you're getting tested frequently, then that means that one of your sex buyers came in and infected you.
Yeah.
That sex buyer is not getting banned. They're not getting tested, but this person now loses their livelihood. There's so many stories that I can share, but just for the sake of time, I just want to be really clear. When we talk about legalizing commercial sex, and I don't call it prostitution, I call it commercial sex for a reason, because prostitution has such a negative connotation, and we have a very specific image of what we think about. And so I call it commercial sexual activity or commercial sex. If we think about legalizing commercial sex, we literally are not oftentimes thinking about the lack of protections that will be there for the people who are selling sex, or the reasons why folks got into the commercial sexual industry. Oftentimes, people who are selling sex in some way, shape, or form, or trading sex, they were either thrown out of their home as a child, they might have grown up in poverty, they probably, upwards of 80%, have had a history of childhood sexual abuse, so they have broken boundaries, poor imaging, all of these things that basically create this perfect storm to be taken advantage of, usually as children, as minors. But it's literally this like lack of other options creates a pathway. And so if we only ever focus on, well, should we legalize it? And we don't think about the safety and protections that will actually not be there for the people that are selling sex. And we don't ever think about it as, what was the catalyst that created the pathway for these folks to get into selling commercial sex? What kind of educational services do they need? What kind of health services do they need? What kind of social services do they need so that they might feel more empowered to do whatever it is that they actually really wanted to do? Yeah. Because people don't just wake up and say, I think I want to have sex with 15 different guys, maybe earn enough money to survive for the day, maybe feel like okay, but honestly, like the amount of mental health diagnoses that come out of it, it's not ends the lifespan of these folks. There's so much danger involved in it. There's so much abuse. There's so much physical, emotional. I know young people, 15-year-old girl who was thrown out of a car by her boyfriend, who was also her trafficker, who was shoved downstairs because she was pregnant and he wanted her to abort. Like, those are the things that happen when you are involved in the commercial sex industry. Yeah. It's not these folks loving you, telling you you're beautiful. If you do research on sex buyers, which I started doing a while ago, and I'm currently writing a paper on sex buyers, you see that sex buyers have this notion about commercial sex where they are so focused on the commodity and the exchange and them being able to do whatever it is that they want to do, and not focused or asking a minor if they're a minor, or a person if they've eaten that day, or if they're tired. Yeah. I knew a young person that said that she was like, oh, my trafficker was nice because at least he would buy me tampons when I was on my period, but my friend's trafficker wasn't nice, and she would say pimp, but I use traffickered. But she said that her friend's trafficker never let her shower. And so she would always try to make the guy that was buying sex ejaculate as fast as possible so that she could take a shower as soon as they were done. Wow. Because that was going to be the only shower that she would get. Oh, and sometimes she could, and sometimes she couldn't. It's like, those are the stories that we need to be talking about. Yeah. We need to be talking about, as these people are engaging in commercial sexual activity, they're not going to school oftentimes. They're not working in other capacities where they can build other skills. And there is an age at which people will either stop buying sex from you or stop buying sex as frequently, and you are inherently seen as less valuable. Yeah. And what happens then? Yeah. Then you have no skills. You might have an addiction to substances. You probably have a lot of health conditions happening.
So much of it really comes down to looking at it holistically. Again, getting back to the person, but then also looking at the system surrounding it, looking to what is the society that we live in,
right,
that not only allows people to be left with so few options, but also really glorifies the buying of commercial sex.
Right.
And I think that I love that you're writing a paper about buyers of sex, because I think it's so important, because even when it happens abroad, a lot of times it is U.S. men purchasing. So I would love if you could talk a little bit more about how, buyers within the U.S. actually really perpetuate so much of this issue.
I mean, we are a very wealthy nation, and we know that people. So I did some preliminary research in the red light district in Tijuana, Mexico. And we would go to this hotel, and we would sit on the top, like we're totally protected. And like in this area where people aren't looking up, they're in the red light district. They're looking around at the women who are standing in the alleyways trying to get them to purchase sex. And we would see mostly white men in the red light district, oftentimes married. You know, it was like 9:00 in the morning.
Oh my gosh.
And we would see them. Did they just drop their kids off at school? You know, and like one thing that is very, very clear based on the research that I've done is we have this misconception that sex buyers are like these weird, creepy sociopaths. Like, no, they don't know anyone. They're totally disconnected, off the grid, and they're just going and they're like doing terrible things to like people that they buy sex from. But the reality is that oftentimes sex buyers, majority that I've seen in the research I've done globally across the world, they are employed, they're in relationships, or they're married, or they're living with someone. They have enough of a disposable income that they can go and buy sex. They are likely going to have an education, right? So higher than high school education. They're people that we know. They are. And it's estimated across the world in most countries that between 10% and 20% of populations of men will purchase sex at some point in their lives. So that's the estimate. Here in the United States, we can see around that kind of percentage. And, you know, sex buyers, most research concentrates on sex buyers who are 18 years old and older. But there's sex buyers as old as like 70s, 80s, 90s.
Wow.
And sometimes those sex buyers, they might be looking more for companionship, you know, but still they're commodifying people's bodies and doing what they want to do in that time frame. And really, you know, like I said, they're not asking folks, are they safe? Are they comfortable? Are you okay? They're getting their needs fulfilled. And that's why they're there.
And I think that, you know, even just zooming out further about all this, just like we're talking about, you know, the society that we live in, like what someone doesn't just wake up and say, oh, I want to have sex with like 15 strangers for a living, right? But they get there for a reason. And I feel like we've normalized this buying of commercial sex. But like if you really zoomed out, it's like, how did we get there? You know, where that's like not only normal, but like kind of glorified of like, oh yeah, like you're a man now. You just went and had a, you know. So I think that even beyond that, it starts with the imagery we see in our media of like sexualizing girls from a very young age. And you know, it's so subtle. But once I don't know about you, but like once you engage in this work, it's so blatantly obvious. And that there's these little seeds that are planted in subconsciously like whetting this appetite to like go and do those things that seem so extreme. But it started somewhere. It's a culmination of this culture that we've allowed.
And really, I mean, if we get to the crux of it, it's patriarchy and it's misogyny. We live in a patriarchal society. We live in a misogynistic society. And we also live in a racist society. And so that also comes into play. So when we think about who's being bought and sold for sex, oftentimes it's actually Black girls, Latinx girls, it's youth of color, children of color that are being exploited predominantly by white men. And we know, you know, if we think about just like, again, holistically, like you were saying, or pornography, sex trafficking is in pornography, right? All of these things where, and that's like this extreme sense, but it really shows the ways in which like fetishes are real, racism is real within commercial sex, all of these things that are perpetuating discrimination and all of these isms that are really, you know, harmful to people. But yeah, like in everyday media, you know, we glorify youth, beauty. Women want, you know, beauty products that are going to make them look youthful because we have been trained, socially conditioned to believe that youthhood equals beauty.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I cringe all the time when I don't watch a lot of TV. One, I don't have a lot of time. And two, it's not my form of self-care. But when I do, and I see commercials and I'm just like, you know, I ask all these questions like, why does that little girl have to be wearing a 2-piece bikini? Why does I go to Target and I'm like, why is this shirt so provocative for a little girl?
Yeah.
And then you look at the boys section and you're like, totally different. Why does everything that we find as attractive skin tight? You know, and like, I'm perfectly aware of the ways in which that I've bought into those beauty standards. I know I buy makeup. I know I get my hair done. I know what I buy. And I know that. But I don't believe that it's right and it's fair that we ingrain it into children before they even know what they could like, that they need to wear these things. Because really, like, who's creating the clothes? Who are the people that are creating the commercials? Who's creating the TV show that's talking about a little girl and a foot fetish? Right? Like, who's creating it? It's people in positions of power, predominantly men, most likely, probably white men, you know, and like, I'm not trying to demonize all white men because, you know, I know plenty of white men. Shout out to my former roommate, Rob, who are great and amazing people, you know. But I do know that there's real power and privilege that exists in being a white person and being a man. And that, I think, is really at the heart of a lot of patriarchy that exists, and for a lot of this to be perpetuated. And, you know, you were asking, like, who's going to buy Saks? It's the people in positions of power with money and affluence who can go to Thailand and just buy sex for the weekend and come back.
And the same people that have the power to make sure that legislation is putting more of the onus on the people selling sex rather than. So it's like, you know, I like to really zoom this out and make it macro, because I think, especially if you haven't had an experience like us where you've met these children and you have that like heart connection, it can be really hard to really empathize and then also feel really overwhelmed by the magnitude of it. But I think if we zoom out and look at this, it's not about like, you know, it's systems. And that's actually another way that you can practically help, is being aware of the ways in which we're sending these messages to young kids. Because as a parent, that's one way, like, you have influence on raising up the next generation. Teaching your boys how to respect women, teaching girls of their value, you know? And so I think it starts with getting curious. Like you said, asking the questions of, why is this the norm that there's skin tight clothing and all these things? And I'll be the first to admit too, like, I've definitely bought into those things too. So there's no shame in any of this because that's just like the reality of where we're at. But I think if we're looking at really making any lasting change and putting an end to it, it starts like generationally with like, how do we stop this for the next generation? And so much of it does start in a cultural, you know.
Agreed. So related to person-centered language, I think it's incredibly important that we work against really stigmatizing language, like quote unquote prostitution, prostitute, sex worker. You know, folks, like I said, this is an outsider's perspective. This is someone with no lived experience. People with lived experience, they have the autonomy and the agency to select the language that they want to use, and I will honor that. But as a person from the outside who's done a lot of research, who's worked with a lot of people, who knows when I say something like sex worker or prostitute, everybody has an image. And there's misconceptions. People think of the Julia Roberts movie, right? They think of this like this sex buyer who comes and just wants companionship and is like going to whisk away, like save this, you know. There's like that kind of false misconception of like, that's what commercial sex could look like. Or people think of dirtiness, stigma, in basically like dehumanize people within the commercial sex industry. So I don't use those terms because I don't want to perpetuate these misconceptions. Yeah. I really like to say, someone with lived experience, a person who sells sex, a person who is engaging in commercial sex activity, and so really just working away from, and I have to correct myself all the time. I will say things like, oh, a survivor or a victim. And then I have to stop and say a person who has been victimized, a person who has, and so I think it's something that doesn't just come naturally. And you said this before, it's a mouthful, and it takes time. But I think really stopping before you call someone a prostitute, before you say prostitution or sex work, and just put the humanity back in it for a second. Yeah. I say the sex industry, the commercial sex industry.
Yeah. And bringing it back to what you said, focus on serving other people, because ultimately, no pun intended, like we're imperfect. We're not going to be perfect at this, right? But so we can't allow the fear of saying the wrong thing to keep us from taking action. However, in order to have the sensitivity, the way that you can ensure that you will have that empathy is to focus on serving people. Yeah. And then within that, there's the space and the grace to say the wrong things. And
exactly. Yeah, I love that, the grace. Like I mess up all the time. Are you kidding? Yeah. I can tell a quick story. This one time we were giving a tour to some youth with lived experience, and I wore a nonprofit shirt, and I was part of that nonprofit. I was an intern at the time. Saving Innocence, based here in Los Angeles County. Love them. Shout out to Saving Innocence. Yeah.
Did I tell you about I knew Kim?
Oh, it was right.
It's like really long, like short story long. Anyone listening, like I was, my roommate and I, who also works within the anti-human trafficking space. Yeah. We were looking for a place like last summer and almost lived in Kim's house. And she's like, wait, you girls I started Saving Innocence. And then a few months later, I got connected to you.
Yeah, so random.
Sorry, didn't mean to derail your story.
It's a small anti-trafficking field. Yeah. It really is. Yeah. There's a core, I feel like it's expanding, and I love that, but there's like a core group of folks doing this work, and everyone kind of knows each other at this point. Yeah.
So you're working for Saving Innocence. You're interning.
So I was interning for Saving Innocence. I was still a student. I get to UCLA. We're giving a tour. I walk up in the Saving Innocence shirt, not thinking anything of it. And one young woman, she was maybe 14. She was a teenager. And she was like, why do you have to wear that shirt? And I was like, and she's like, why do they have to know we're from Saving Innocence? Why can't we just be a group? And she put me in my place, rightfully so. Wow. And one of the case managers was like, hey, like, it's okay. Sarah's like, she made a mistake. It's okay. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to do. Like, I could go back to my car. And I can't remember if I turned my shirt inside out or if I went back to my car and looked for another one or if I put a sweater on. But I did whatever I could in the moment. And it was one of those moments of like, I messed up. I'm still learning. And then after, she was really nice to me and really sweet. But sometimes you kind of have to get that jolt of like, hey, that's not okay. For you to be like, oh, how can I make this better? Right. How can I do what is actually the most appropriate thing in this moment? Yeah.
And just like anything else. I mean, before this conversation, Mark, who helps with the production of this podcast, he's also an actor. We were talking about like so many of us as actors that are now creating our own content, like had the fear of putting ourselves out there because we were scared it was going to be like crappy student films at first, which like they were, right? But like you kind of like have to allow yourself to be put out there and make mistakes, and that's how you learn. So whether it's in the anti-trafficking work or in student films or whatever, like we can't let our anxieties and our fear hold us back, because otherwise we're not going to really step into this fruitful work and have that change. So and I'm grateful, like you said, it is a really small industry, but also like I feel like I'm meeting more and more people that have this passion, that want to help, that, like I said earlier, like I learned through our conversation in February about having this person-centered language. And it's something that I'm not perfect in, but it's on my consciousness now. And now every person I meet, I try to spread that. And it's like, you know, like we all can agree that we're trying to make an impact. So instead of like putting so much pressure on ourselves and others, get back to the one and serving people.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. Well, so just kind of winding down here, we covered a lot today. I think anyone listening that really wants to help might be like, okay, like what do I do now? So if you could leave listeners with one thing, what would it be?
I mean, there's so many things. But I guess, you know, keep watching videos, keep learning, keep reading, keep finding new sources. Yeah.
Because so much of what we talked about, like just scratch the surface. Like I feel like we covered a lot of different things like legislation and buyers and culture. Like there's so much within each of that you can do a deep dive into and like still come up asking questions. So I think like if something in this like affected you and got you curious, I would just encourage you to follow that inkling, you know, and look for ways that you can serve. It doesn't have to be like, you don't have to be this like badass researcher like Sarah or, you know, be making a documentary, you know, like you don't have to do these grand sweeping things. And I think sometimes that even before I was at this point of doing this film, I felt like, well, what do I have to offer to this? But there's so much that can be done.
Agreed. So. Yeah, I think the more that you learn, the more that these become household conversations. And like it starts with just having a conversation and learning and going from there. And I love that you said like you don't have to do these grand gestures. You really don't. Like if you can donate to local nonprofits, your clothes, your time, your money, like resources, if you could, you know, just have a conversation with a young person about not buying sex or about knowing that they're worth more than their body.
That's powerful. And so anyone listening, if they want to connect or learn more about the research and work you're doing, how can they do that?
Sure. So we have a website at UCLA research group that I'm part of. It's called Commercial Sexual Exploitation Research Group. But the website is cscresearch.mednet.ucla.edu.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I'm like, this has been such a gift to me. I'm like, I could continue talking to you for hours.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and expertise with everyone listening.
Thank you for your time. I'm so grateful and delighted by this podcast. I'm just grateful that it exists.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening and leaning into this conversation. I'll see you next week.